everyone, on behalf of the Mindalia TV team, welcome again to Mindalia live streaming. Our guest today is Gary Heseltine. The space that's about to start is why scientists and academics need to recognize Ufologymeet. Gary is the editor of UFO Truth magazine, and he is the vice president and founder of ICER. It is now my pleasure to leave you with Gary Heseltine. Gary, the screen is all yours. We are ready to hear what you are bringing to us today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me onto your program. It's always a pleasure to be invited overseas, and it's obviously an absolute delight. My lecture today will really focus on why scientists and academics really have got to come to terms with ufologists and now sit around the table. So that's the premise of what we're going to talk about. Now, I don't know whether if Myrna wants me to use a PowerPoint or anything like that to assist in this. I could do, up to you. No? Okay. All right. Well, realistically, this stems from the fact that we have a situation that is unprecedented at the moment. It's unprecedented because this year, 2021, is shaping up to be the most important year in ufology since the 1950s, since really the early part. Arguably 1952 was the most important, when there were a number of overflights over Washington, DC, over 2 successive weekends in July of 1952. And that led to a very famous press conference. But let's begin by what has changed and why, in a sense, scientists have got to start to come together with ufologists and academics the same, and look at this subject through fresh eyes, through their perspective, I think everybody recognizes, whichever side of the fence you're on, whether you're an academic or a scientist or a ufologist, a UAP researcher, that the moment of contact, whenever that is acknowledged by society, that it will be the most profound moment in human history. So nobody's really doubting that. The question is, has the contact already happened? Did it begin a long time ago? So that's really what we're going to explore. Like I said, 2021 is, I'm now 61 years of age, and this is the most important year in ufology that I can remember in my lifetime. So born in 1960, all right? And it's so important for a number of reasons. For those of you that are aware, on the 25th of June, the Director of National Intelligence released an unclassified 9-page document about UAP activity involving basically US Navy pilots and also the personnel. As a result of that, legislation was then put into place to say that there has to be initially a report that comes every 90 days to Congress, to the Senate and Congress. And then since then, we've had further amendments and legislation that are still ongoing. And then only recently we've had the Gillibrand Amendment, which basically says that there has to be a reporting year on year to Congress. So whereas in the past, nobody really wanted to tackle the subject, produce any kind of data or even seek to put data together, that has all changed. And in recent months, we now have a proposal to create a specialist office dealing with the UAP phenomena inside the Pentagon. Now, we've never had that open acknowledgement that there is a real need to study this. There have been so many comments made by leading people, former directors of national intelligence, former FBI directors, and even presidents. And when you look at President Obama, said on the James Corden comedy type talk show, just in, I think it was May of this year, he basically said for the first time, and bear in mind, he has been interviewed on TV literally thousands of times and asked this question about flying saucers, UFOs, little green men. Now, he always used to joke and be very vague, but what he said on that show was particularly different, and it was just 1 month before the release of that famous report. And we'll come back to that. And what he basically said was, actually, there are things, in all seriousness, that are flying around in US airspace, and we don't know what they are, and we don't understand how they move. Now, that was totally unprecedented for him to say that, because he's actually been quite specific there. No president had ever spoken in that term before. So again, a significant thing. Now, one of the most recent things that's just happened is the fact that we've got the likes of Harvard professor Avi Loeb coming forward and announcing his Galileo project, which I think has already received several millions of dollars in funding. And that basically is going to look into 3 areas, but one of those areas, the third one, is to look at the UAP phenomenon. Now, just a few years ago, the idea that a Harvard professor would even glance at the UFO UAP topic would be outrageous. But now we have a leading professor. He wrote the book Extraterrestrial about the interstellar object Oumuamua, and he thought that that was the first interstellar, he believes, extraterrestrial object. And he said that because basically it instead of being governed by gravity, it accelerated away from the sun, which is impossible if it was a meteorite where it would be burning up. So there was some kind of propulsion, and that's what he's basically saying, that it was long, it was thin. Was it a remnant of an old civilization that's maybe no longer a place, but it was still on some kind of track? Who knows? But he theorized that the fact that it defied gravity to pull away under acceleration meant that it was under its intelligent control. So this is incredible what's going on. And literally almost monthly now, we are engaging with different aspects that have never really been dealt with before. It's all been in the shadows. Everything has been ridiculed. Okay, so let's talk about what that 9-page unclassified report said that was released on the 25th of June. Well, reading between the lines, the 9 pages was disappointment. But when you did read between the lines, if you knew the subject, you would realize that it was actually pretty important. Because what it said was, and I thought it was absolutely deliberately done this way, it said that of the 144 cases that had been looked at by the US Air Force Task Force, only one of them could be explained in a conventional terrestrial explanation. Now, it didn't come out and say that the other 143 were alien, but what it said was that they were unidentified. But if you knew what they were talking about, really, we're talking about sophisticated, highly trained pilots. So think of it this way: 143 pilots, Navy pilots, could not identify what they were looking at in whilst they're in the air. Now, if you think of all the might and sophistication and technology that America boasts, that's a pretty staggering statistic. And I think that was, people overlooked that. But 143 out of 144 pilots could not identify what they're looking at. Now, if you're a fighter pilot, which is what these are, your life will depend on instant recognition of whether it's friend or foe. So the fact that 143 couldn't identify means that they're really, really confused. And that is interesting. What it also said in that 9-page report that a lot of people didn't pick up on was the fact that over 80 of the 143 cases that were unidentified were captured on what was called multiple sensors. So aircraft sensors, ship, USS Nimitz, USS Princeton, support carrier ships with radar all picked these objects up on sensor data, which when we talk about data, he's producing absolutely masses of data that scientists could and should be now in detail, because some of the performance characteristics, and we'll go on to this in a bit, are pretty staggering. Now, we also should not forget that 18 of the 143 cases that were unidentified actually were described as involving technology that basically we don't yet understand or have been invented, which is pretty staggering, really, because we're not talking anything there that says the definitive Chinese, Russian. We're saying technology that we basically just don't understand how they move. They seem to defy the laws of physics between the lines. And now let's think about what the Senate got to see in terms of the classified report. We believe that was around 74 pages. And we also believe that they saw about 40 minutes of US Navy authenticated military video in the form of probably FLIR videos, forward-looking infrared radar, captured by the US Navy fighters. And one of the senators who saw that classified footage said it was like watching science fiction, and it put the hairs on the back of your neck. That's how impressed they were. So you could argue that we should be able to strip away the data and maybe the instrumentation data around those clips and just focusing on the object. Those objects, I would say, should be in the public domain. So if we've got something around, let's take all the height, size or whatever, take away whatever data you want, but let's see the images, because there's no reason why those images should not be released, because it's just a thing. But I think if we saw some of these, what I believe to be higher definition videos, I don't think we'd even be having this debate about the subject of it and its reality. But we'll come back to that. One of the things that's really started to change is the difference from 2017. When in 50 years' time, when they write history books about what led to what we would call disclosure with a big D, i.e. the contact moment when all society acknowledges that there is some kind of extraterrestrial or non-human presence interacting with planet Earth, which is what a lot of people think in my world, that we will be thankful for the New York Times article on the 16th of December 2017. The New York Times historically had always taken a very dim view of the UFO subject, and yet here they were on the 16th of December given a front page story about a secret Pentagon UFO program that wasn't even known about, that ran from 2007 onwards, called ATIP, Advanced Aerial Threat Identification Program. And that was led by a guy called Luis Elizondo, who has since become really the go-to guy in terms of the media, because he headed that program. And what was significant about that was the fact that they also released 3 US Navy that was subsequently authenticated military videos. And those 3 videos are the thing that's really changed or let the genie out of the bottle. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is those 3 videos were authenticated military, so nobody could say that they were CGI, made up, etc., etc. They are objects captured by military pilots. And whilst they're fuzzy and grainy because they're in black and white, because they're in the infrared, they did show objects which then matched the testimony and the scientific data that had been recovered, i.e. radar data from those ships and in the air. And what was significant of the 3 videos that was from 2004, the USS Nimitz incident, and then subsequently 2 that were in 2014-15, basically those 3 videos showed something. And the big difference was not for the public and actually not for the Senate. It was the media that really picked up on this, because for the first time, they could look on screen and say to somebody in authority, what is that? that is skimming across the screen. And it was a legitimate question because it was authenticated military video. And for me, that is the big change. Without those 3 videos being released, we wouldn't be having this conversation now. Things would not have moved on so quick. But because they were, and because they move in ways that we don't really understand, it's led to a lot of scientists, academics having to reevaluate the whole UAP subject, because just maybe there is something to it. Obviously, as a result of that, the Navy Task Force was created within the last 12, 18 months to examine and recover and retrieve, put together this report. Now, we know that it was understaffed. There were only actually 2 people involved in that. A task force makes it sound like there were many hundreds, but it was actually 2 people with probably a lot of other people helping in various departments. So it was underfunded. Whereas now, we now know, we said at the start of this program, that there is now going to be much better structure involving many hundreds, if not thousands of people collectively. Now, one of the things that came from the release of the videos was that eventually it's led to pressure being mounted for some kind of explanation from or to a report to the Congress. Now, one of the things that happened a month before the release of the DNI report in June was that in May, the most prestigious documentary film series in the United States, which is called 60 Minutes, did a 14-minute segment on UFOs. Now, this is again like the New York Times. They would never go like near this subject, and you know, it was always been ridiculed over the many decades. And here they are doing a factual, serious piece, talking to several of the military pilots who were involved in those incidents with the 3 videos. And they had to acknowledge that what the pilots were saying and the data that had been recovered was highly compelling. And I'll come back to it in a bit, but Luis Elizondo, who ran that program, basically said on that 60-minute segment, this is what we're dealing with. And this is not the exact wording, but it's paraphrasing, is that basically you're dealing with something that can travel at 13,000 miles an hour, can pull 500 to 600 G-forces, has no tail, no wings, no propulsion system that you can see, and it can also travel underwater, i.e. transmedium, as Luis Elizondo would call it. Now, that is what we're dealing with. So this is what should be making scientists and academics prick their ears up, because if we've got data, scientific data that corroborates what he's saying, then that has to begin to make them interested. Because this is, as Luis Elizondo said, we're not talking a next generation leap in technology by the Russians or the Chinese. We're talking a 50 to 1,000 year jump in technology, which is just unheard of. So somebody must be creating that technology. That's basically what he was saying. Now, a lot of people think that there is no good data prior to 2004 in the USS Nimitz incident, which is the first of the 3 FLIR videos that we talked about. But that's not true. Anybody that's studied the subject will know that there are a lot of excellent cases throughout the 1940s all the way up to 2004, when in a sense we become current with the release of the Nimitz video. And I want to draw reference to some of the scientific data that is impressive. And for example, on the 30th or 31st of March 1990, there was what was called the Belgium Dogfight. Now, to put this in perspective, for about 2 years, Belgium experienced a huge number of triangular shaped objects seen low, i.e. at just a few hundred feet altitude, above many towns. Hundreds of police officers all over Belgium saw them and were reported also by members of the public and military parties, etc. Well, on this particular night, 31st of March, 1990, 7 radar systems locked on to an unidentified object, a UFO. And 2 F-16 fighter jets were sent up to intercept. Now, bear in mind that before the intercept aircraft were sent up, people and police officers had reported visually seeing these objects close to the ground. So we did have a visual identification. By the time the pilots were scrambled, they never saw these things visually. But what they did get straight away was confirmed airborne radar and confirmed ground radar. And this wasn't just one Belgium RAF station tracking this object whilst they got into it, they chased it. There were 7 radar systems from 7 different airports, 3 military airports and 4 civilian airports, all in different geographical areas using different types of radar. We're all tracking this incident where the 2 planes are chasing this object. And the point being that they went into a kind of a dogfight situation where for 75 minutes, approximately 75 minutes, they chased this object and they couldn't get close to it. At one point, they got what was called lock-on. A lock-on is where you ordinarily, it locks onto the image and then they can fire the weapons and destroy if this was in a conventional war. But this object broke several lock-ons, which is not supposed to happen. Now, later on after the incident, the aircraft data, telemetry data, was investigated by a top Belgian civilian researcher called Emil Schweitzer. And he was the top radar specialist in Belgium. And he said in an interview to a researcher called Harry Harris, UK researcher, and he did it on video. He said at one point the objects pulled 35 Gs in one particular movement. Now, bear in mind this is 1990, so this is not, there were no real drones of any ability in 1990. Even now, even our top pilots, Top Gun pilots, can only pull 10 to 11 Gs wearing special suits. Beyond that, you pass out, the inertia is too great. Okay, and these objects in 1990 were pulling 35 Gs. So this is a technology that was in our airspace, well, in the Belgian airspace. Now let's take this a bit further. Now, ordinarily, the military governments are loath to actually talk about the UAP subject and give it any credence. But the Belgian senior military officer who saw the videos, and basically one of the 2 aircraft had video recorded all the cockpit instrumentation. So we could then see and study all the telemetry data. And he unusually called a public press conference, and his name was Colonel Wilfred de Brouwer, who was the Chief of Air Staff of the Royal Belgium Air Force. He called a press conference and he said, I want you to look at this because this is kind of weird. And he said, and I think this is, you've got to bear in mind his 1990 quote and think where we are now, 31 years later. He said, the day will undoubtedly come when the phenomena will be observed with technological means of detection and collection that won't leave a single doubt about its origins. Now, if you think about that, that's what the USS Nimitz did in 2004. So 14 years later, all the technical systems were in place. The technology had evolved to the point, the sensors were evolved to the point where they could capture these objects in ways that couldn't be captured before. So in a sense, he's quite prophetic. So that's where we're at now. And then he actually added again another great quote a year later in 1991, where he summed up what the Belgian Air Force thought about this incident in 1990. And he said, in any case, the Air Force has arrived to the conclusion that a certain number of anomalous phenomena has been produced within Belgian airspace. So what he's saying is it was real. It happened in our airspace. And that was 1991. So a very important comment And he has subsequently spoken many times publicly about what he thought that was. Now, let's look at the 2004 USS Nimitz incident, the Tic Tac incident, as it's called. Multiple pilots visually witnessed the object. The objects are seen on multiple sensors. The object, at least one object, was captured on FLIR infrared video. And also the support ship, the USS Princeton, detected multiple objects on radar showing incredible performance characteristics. Now, I said this right at the beginning. Let's come back to this and talk about this now. The USS Princeton was like a destroyer type ship that would accompany the aircraft carrier, one of its support ships. And it had monitored objects, not one, but maybe 5, 10 at a time, often dropping from great altitude, i.e. 80,000 feet, coming straight down as in vertical descent, which we can't do in conventional flight. So dropping like a stone, stopping on a dime at 50 feet above the water, above the ocean. That drop from 80,000 feet to 50 feet above the water, 0.8 of 1 second. Think about that. 0.8 of 1 second to drop from 80,000 feet to 50 feet above the water. Now that involves hundreds of G-forces, and don't forget it came to an instant stop. So it's dropped like a stone and then suddenly stopped. Well, we can't do that. So we're talking about a technology that someone possesses that we don't have. And it isn't Chinese and it isn't Russian. The leap is too great. We can't even attempt to do what this object did. The videos there, like I said, they are the key to where this discussion is now. We wouldn't be having this discussion with you now and all the discussions that have happened in 2021, this legislation, etc., if these 3 videos hadn't come out. Because then the authorities would have said, well, there's no proof. We don't see any proof. But these videos, suddenly the media could go, what is that? What is that? And there's some people who had to change their attitudes. Like I said earlier, we mentioned Avi Loeb at Harvard University. He has obviously launched the Galileo project. And then we've got UFOs and scientists and academics coming together in certain areas. We have an organization called SKU, Scientific Coalition on UAP. And this is predominantly about 65, 70 scientists, basically in the United States, who now have come together to study some of the best cases and then produce reports, scientific reports. And that's what's needed. We need scientists to examine the best data so they can produce summary conclusions. And they, for example, there's a very famous clip from Puerto Rico in 2013 near an airport called Aguadilla in Puerto Rico, where an object is captured on camera and followed for several minutes as it flew around the airport. At one point, it goes into the ocean and then suddenly 2 objects are there, almost if it's broke in half, but there's no impact, and 2 objects are flying side by side. It's bizarre. But they examined this footage and said, we're dealing with something that's anomalous. So this is what's needed by the scientific community. And then, as I said, the Galileo project is now going to be one of the leading places where they're going to be looking at the UAP topic specifically. And like I said, when you know, there are some scientists who are a bit like pop stars. They have this, you know, huge following. And one of them is Michio Kaku. You know, you've often seen him. He's the kind of like the, I don't know, Oriental looking guy that you often see on TV documentaries. And he used to be very skeptical of the UFO subject. But after seeing those 3 videos, he said this: we've now reached a turning point. It used to be that believers had to prove that these objects were from an intelligent race in outer space. And this is the change. He said now the burden of proof is on the government to prove that they're not from an intelligent beings from outer space. So he was completely kind of like 100% reversal as a result of those three Fleur videos. But not everyone is convinced. And one of the other big kind of like science pop stars is Neil deGrasse Tyson. And on the 2021, I made a note when he posted something on Facebook, a still image of one of the Tic Tac video. And so that proved to me that I'd at least seen the footage. So you've got Mitch Yukaku absolutely blown away and turns 100% and says, now we've got to prove that it's not. Whereas he said on the 5th of March, not knowing what it is does not count as evidence for knowing what it is, which is an absolutely true statement. But he is someone who to this day makes almost absurd claims about the best UFO cases, and it's like he's burying his head in the sand. Well, I think that Neil deGrasse Tyson is probably going to do himself no favors at all, because the more and more the scientific data from all these military incidents is released to the public, or parts of it released, the more this is going to show that we're dealing with something that's not Chinese, not Russian, it's not American. They've ruled themselves out, voluntarily ruled themselves out, saying it's not secret US tech, that basically we're dealing with something that's from elsewhere. Now, elsewhere could be likely to be extraterrestrial because the universe is so vast. Now, I never really understand the argument that scientists and astronomers have saying about the distances, because if you went back 500 years, getting from London to Paris would have taken you an age if you could have crossed the ocean. But technology has moved, so everything reduces. So if a species developed intelligent life a million years ahead of Earth time, do you think they're going to be driving around in petrol-driven cars and flying jet engines? They're not. They're going to be a million years ahead of us in technology. So who knows? We can't even predict accurately 50 years of technology ahead. Nobody's ever done it accurately. That's 50 years, but what if it's 1,000 years, 500,000 years, a million years? It's a ridiculous argument. The world and technology and space travel would reduce dramatically. Why wouldn't it? But this is one of the sides of science that typically has quite a narrow field of view of things. They do great work, but it's in a very specific area, and they need to widen it. So all of the things that's happening now is really not just UFO researchers saying, look, we've got some good cases. It's now saying, look, we've actually got the data to prove that this is real. And don't forget, the Americans have admitted that these objects are real. And the Tic Tac incident was estimated to be 40 feet in diameter. Now that's pretty big, almost the size of the fighter jets that were involved. So really, we're at a stage now where we need to take a global approach, because in the end, we are just one species, the human race. And what did Reagan say many years ago on several occasions? I often think what would happen if we were faced by an extraterrestrial threat, that we would set aside our differences and come together and speak as one voice, as the human race. Well, that's where we're at now. And so scientists, academics need to come together. And that's in a sense why ISA, the International Coalition for Extraterrestrial Research, comes in, and I'm the vice president. And we're made up of 28 national countries, which involve a mixture of scientists, academics, and leading UFO, UAP researchers. We have to now all come together and put egos aside and say, look, the time is, let's just all work together for the course of the human race. We are just one species. We have to set aside differences and begin to look at this subject on a global front for the very first time.
Gary, thank you for bringing us this information. And this brings me to one of the questions that I actually wanted to have the opportunity to ask you.
Okay.
Are we really ready as a collective to digest the idea of sharing this planet with other species? Because by the way we relate to animals, the way we relate to even other humans, I would say we're not. I mean, if I was an alien, I would die of fear just to imagine of me being faced to walk any street on Earth. So how are we, like, what would be the impact on society, like cultural, between
Well,
humans? That's something that always calls my attention.
well, I think it's a very complex question, and I don't think anybody has the definitive answer. What I would say is that we're not ready in some ways, and in other ways we are. But one of the things that we're trying to say in ISA is that we should be preparing for this moment now. Because if we are moving closer to this big disclosure moment, don't forget 95% of the people, the public, have been led to believe that there's nothing to the subject. So they have grown all their life from 1953 onwards with what's called the Robertson panel, which basically said we're going to debunk everything from 1953 and attack the witnesses. So that's how the ridicule began. But so anybody born after 1953 has lived in a world of, in a sense, deliberate debunking. Now, as that stigma goes because of the release of the Fleur videos and now the legislation that's coming in, it means we can have a serious discussion. But we think that we should be preparing now. And hence why ISA is saying we're preparing awareness courses to all sectors of society to make them realize that actually there is something to this. We want to educate you through basically giving you a bit of a history of the subject, so the impact is not as great. Now, obviously, we're living through a pandemic, and a lot of people didn't anticipate the effect of lockdowns. And there is a parallel here, because what we do know now is that many people in virtually every country where they've had lockdowns, they're all saying they've had a huge increase in the number of mental health issues related to isolation and the lockdown issues, because it never happened before. Well, in our lifetimes and in the history of this planet, we've never had an acknowledgement that there is a presence interacting with planet Earth. So that could again mean that there could well be a proportion of society that just can't psychologically deal with that. Whereas we should be trying to prepare people now rather than let them hit a brick wall in a year's time and say, oh, well, actually, yeah, we've ruled out China, we've ruled out America, we've ruled out Russia, and yeah, we're dealing with other extraterrestrial, stroke, non-human. That's going to be a big impact for a sector. Now, I don't think like Orson Welles in 1938, when they did the famous broadcast and thousands went to the mountains thinking there was a genuine Martian invasion. I think the world has moved on a lot. Technology and communication has changed tremendously. But people would still go to work. People would still get up, do whatever they do. But there would be a proportion of society, maybe 20%, something like that, that would find it extremely frightening, an invasion element, threat, who may psychologically really be traumatized. And we should not allow that to happen, because we can prevent it by talking about it now and start saying, well, we should be looking at the what if it is real question now. So that's the way I would look at it. But from what you said, you're absolutely right. And I think that the human race is very primitive, and in technological terms, we're probably like an ant in the playground. Well, when the child is in the playground, does the child talk to the ant? They don't, because they think that they're far superior to the ant and they're not on the same wavelength. Well, who knows that ET, non-human intelligences, are looking at us as a very warlike species that are more likely to kill them when they land on the White House lawn than engage with them. So who knows what is really going on? But it's, I think we can deal with it, but we have to prepare people.
Well, with your answer, you actually brought me to my next question, and it's something that I'm very curious about. This, when we look for intelligent life, I think we're very reductionist. We are only focusing on intelligence manifested through bodies that are similar than ours. We're only looking as if intelligence could only manifest in a biochemical vessel like our bodies. But could we be wrong about this? Could intelligence be manifesting in any other form that we're not even familiar with that we could not be perceiving through our five senses, for example?
I know you're absolutely right. If you think about it, let's use kind of an example that proves how futile this debate is if you were, most people now carry a smartphone. The smartphone is a computer, a video recorder, an audio device, a telephone communication system. And if you were, say, to take that iPhone and give it to Leonardo da Vinci 400 years ago and say, Leonardo, you are the most excellent brain for hundreds of years, considered a genius. Tell me how this iPhone works or this smartphone works. And because in that 400 years, the leap in technology is so great, there's no way he could explain anything to him, or he would be able to explain anything, because the leap in technology is too great and it would just appear as magic. So if you think about it, that's a similar kind of thing to what we're saying. How would we know? How? We just don't know. We are so primitive. And if there is a civilization just 1,000 years ahead of us, who knows what technology, what philosophies they will have developed. You know, maybe they were a warlike species and then over time said, no, we've got rid of our nuclear weapons. And one of the interesting things, Myrna, that really comes into this is that over the last, well, since the 1940s, there is a huge confirmed correlation between UFOs, UAPs having an interest in all things nuclear. So there are many, many sightings near nuclear power plants, nuclear ships, nuclear weapons storage areas, etc. And that in many countries worldwide is the same and has been the same since the 1940s. Now that would say to me, as an observer looking in, that they basically don't like nuclear weapons. Well, why would they not like nuclear weapons? Well, I can only surmise that they would see that we're capable of destroying the Earth, this beautiful planet, by mutual assured destruction, a nuclear war. Now, if you now look at it, people say, well, Gary, where do they come from? And I said, I don't know. I said, but I look at it that we're probably a bit like an oasis in the desert in this part of the cosmic neighborhood. So if you think about it, you're in the desert, there's no planets that are life, then suddenly you've got this little blue planet that's absolutely teeming with water, diverse life, and sentient beings. Wow, that would make you a good place to stop off for a holiday. And there's probably space tourism as well going on. Probably there is also experimentation going on, because if we went to the Great Barrier Reef and we came across a new species of shark, what would we do? We'd send all our top scientists who like studying sharks to the Great Barrier Reef and say, look, we found this brand new species. Let's go and look, and they filming them. We'll examine them in their natural habitat. We'll maybe kill one or two for scientific research, and we'll do some dissection. Absolutely. So why can't that be happening to us? And that would explain why there is the abduction phenomenon going on. And also there are reports of animal mutilations around the world. So these kind of things actually have parallels, and I think make perfect sense. And I've always said personally that they are interested in nuclear weapons also, because I suspect that in our deepest oceans, there are underwater bases. And for those people who aren't aware, the UFOs are often seen coming in and out of water, and they don't crash. They just silently slip into under the water and come out silently, and there's no splash. And it's like they operate in a different way to us. So what is staggering is that we only know 5% of our oceans on Earth. We know more about the surface of Mars, more about the surface of the moon than we do about our own deepest trenches. So if this was their habitat, and if you think about it, if we go back to the moon soon, we're going to set up moon bases. If we get to Mars, we're going to set up Mars bases. So if ET came here a long time ago, what are they going to set up? Earth bases in our deepest trenches, they may have been down there for thousands of years, and they do not want to interact with us in any overt way. And then suddenly we've developed technology that through nuclear assured destruction would render their habitat, i.e. the ocean, contaminated. So that's why they might not like nuclear weapons, because their Earth base might be affected.
Wow, it's interesting that you brought up the figure of Da Vinci and that parallelism with a historical context, because one of the things that I tend to think is that, well, we've been X amount of years, humanity. There's a lot of these agreements in how long we've been here, but we can say that at least 5,000 years we've been living, coexisting with viruses, bacteria, and a bunch of microorganisms that, due to the lack of technology, we never acknowledge their existence. We can definitely say that that's intelligent life. So
absolutely, and we're not actually sure where those viruses came from. And there's an idea, what's called panspermia, that a lot of scientists give credence to, that says that organisms and life forms are carried on meteorites that crash, and that then sets the seeds of life going. I actually think there's more to it than that, because life seems so diverse and complex. And when you look at the DNA, the double helix, etc., it seems like it's created. And don't forget, Francis Crick, the guy who effectively not invented but developed DNA and identified it, he basically said at one point that he thought that mankind had like a sideways insertion of intelligence, like 11% or something like that has been inserted into our DNA to upgrade us. And he was the guy who won the Nobel Prize for DNA, and he said it's come from somewhere else that's upgraded us. So how do we know that an alien species 50,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago, came here, saw a primitive humanoid figure and said we can upgrade them? And that's how that set us on a path to becoming what we call sentient beings now. But we're incredibly arrogant to think that we're the only sentient life, and that in a sense, Earth dominates the universe. It does not. We are just a trivial piece of life in space, because we can't even get our head around the vastness of space. And just in the Milky Way, it's hundreds of millions of stars, and around each star there will be 9 or 10 planets, of which 3 or 4 will have, be near the Goldilocks, too hot, not too cold, and will have the ability to maybe sustain life. So if you just do the maths, it's absolutely inconceivable that we're the only sentient beings, and it's a ridiculous argument. I think most scientists now are actually coming around to that. 20 years ago, they'd say there may be life in space. 10 years ago, they'd say it's probably. Now they're saying it's almost certainty because of the numbers.
I agree with you. It's a matter, I think that anthropocentrism is making us be very, have a very close criteria towards opening and expanding and finding what's out there. We reached the end of this conversation. What would you like to close this space with?
Well, I would just like to thank you for inviting me onto the show, and anytime you want me to, I'll happily come back. I always enjoy talking about this subject, and I hope that I have given you something to think about.
We are also thankful that you accepted our invitation. Until next time, that I hope it's pretty soon. And to those that are beyond the screen, we also want to thank you for joining us. I would like to remind you that we are Mindalia.com, an international nonprofit organization. You can help us just by liking, subscribing, any interaction that you have with us in our different platforms and social media. Help us reach one more person in the planet. We're sending you a very big hug and all our gratitude, and we're gonna meet again in the next Mindalia live streaming. Bye.